Begin looking at it with us, or even as where Craig read. Today we're going to continue in our study of Genesis that gives us a pair of glasses we've been talking about, a lens through which to see the world. That the world of Genesis is our world, even if we may need some new lenses to see it that way. Genesis has presented us with a world created by and for God, by His design, for a specific purpose, thrown off track by rebellion by people. And where we left last is where we'll pick up. We last left Genesis with Noah. Some of you have heard of Noah. Some of you probably have not, but I'll tell you a little bit about Noah. He was the new head of the human race. His family, 3 sons and their wives, survived a terrible moment in human history, probably one of the darkest in human history. And that God brought His wrath down, His rejection of the way humans were living through a great flood, right? The monstrous boat that Noah built, surely some of you have heard of Noah's Ark, bobbed on the water for many days, at least it seems that the water rained. It rained for 40 days, and then it was still water covering the face of the earth for much longer. And he and his family and pairs of every animal of every kind survived the greatest single catastrophe in the history of the world. Now, most natural disasters or world-changing floods, they don't happen with a rhyme or a reason. There's not things that we can point to and say, oh, it's because of this that the tsunami happened in Asia, or it's because of this that the earthquake hit in Nepal, or because of this the earthquake happened in Los Angeles, or tornadoes came across the prairie land in our country. At least it appears to the human eye like that. It doesn't mean that those things are without rhyme or reason. It's just from the human vantage point, we do not understand the outworking. But in this case, we were given window into it, right? God specifically told us the purpose for the geysers and the lightning and the rain that droned on and on and on, and for weeks displayed a purpose. How seriously God viewed sin. And very realistically, we could describe the flood as a living demonstration of God's concern for our sin. Now that's where we left humanity last week. Sin was an assault on God and His creation. It was an attack on who He is and what He has said. It had to be stopped. That's what we don't see often about our sin, but the Genesis account of the flood tells us. Pardon me. I'm really having a coughing fit here. When we look at the next story, we left Noah and his family, right? And under the good graces of God, Noah begins to promise things, or be promised things. God begins to tell him certain things about who He is and what He's going to do. And they line up very purposefully with the early chapters in Genesis. That God reestablishes His covenant. It's not that He sets something up completely new with Noah, but He actually commits to bless him in the ways that He blessed Adam and Eve. He puts new rules in place, yes, but He wants mankind to be fruitful and to fill the earth and to multiply. He wants them to take care of the earth. He wants them to protect life. And of all the lives that God cares about most, He cares about the lives of humans. In chapter 9, we see that. But the new rules are in place, and we think of this, and we look at it, and we see what God has said about sin. But very quickly in Genesis, here's the interesting thing. You look at Genesis chapter 9, right after God blesses Noah, we get a very striking story of the fact that Noah and his family are not pure, and that the problem that caused the flood, human sin, is not eradicated. Genesis chapter 9, verses 18 through 28, Noah is blackout drunk. Okay? Remember what I just said about Noah? Noah is the source, the head of the human race now. He receives all kinds of promises that Adam received. He's the guy. And then right after God gets done saying, you're the head of the earth, you're the new king in creation, we find him grossly blackout drunk and in his tent, and his son Ham dishonors his father. The father of everyone on the planet. Okay, think about that, right? God has judged everyone. So now the father of everyone on the planet is passed out on the sofa, as it were, right? The way we would think of some delinquent father out on the sofa with the TV just droning on at 2 a.m, so to speak. And in a graceful display of his brokenness, he is subject to his creation, right? He's drunk. He's under the influence of the fruit of the earth in the way that Adam was under the influence of the curse because he partake of the fruit of the earth. And even more so, not only that, his child, who should have honored him and respected him, preys on the situation and abuses his father and makes dishonor, defames his father's name. The idea of that story, sin is very clearly not left the building, right? We don't have to stop there. I can summarize it for you to say the world was expunged of almost every life but the people in that boat. But the problem persists because the people in the boat brought their hearts with them. Just as Jesus said, what goes into the body is not what makes people unclean. Circumstances are not the cause of our sin. What comes out of them, out of man's hearts, is what makes them unclean. Mark chapter 7. So, it's 11 a.m. the next morning. Noah wakes up from his hangover, okay? He doesn't remember what happened, but somehow, as he stumbles out of his tent in the middle of the day when he should have been up already, he knows that something has happened to him. And he curses Canaan, as we see in chapter 9. Curse Canaan, which is the son of Ham. Israel would have known that as the people that they were standing on the edge of their land, about to be commissioned by God to go in and take the land. And he goes on to bless the line of Shem and Japheth. Now, we aren't going to pause as we move through Genesis for chapter 10. If you look at chapter 10, there's a long list of genealogies. And it might say a heading like the Table of Nations, all right? And this Table of Nations is not something that we're going to walk through today, but maybe you'll read it this afternoon, and you'll think about it as you think of the story that we're going to talk about now. And what I want you to think when you look at this is that Genesis chapter 10 comes before Genesis chapter 11, not in time, but in the fact that the narrator, Moses, wants us to connect all these nations with Noah. We've seen Noah as the new head of the human race, and we've also seen that Noah and his sons still have a problem that they're carrying on, right? So, what we need to see now is that this Table of Nations shares in their fatherhood from Noah, and we can assume, as will be displayed, shares in the sin problem that is being passed on from generation to generation. So Genesis chapter 10, I want you to read that, and Israel would have read that, and they would see the world as it is right then, and kind of got a history lesson on how the people they know about hundreds of years later all have their source or begin back here and are connected to the world around them. It's as if I put a map of the world and put a laser pointer up there and started to explain that people from these nations, they all kind of migrated from this common place. That's what Genesis chapter 2 helps us to do. But it strikes this note of common ancestry in Noah, a unified ancestry in the person that God had intended to bless, who made a commitment to, and is quickly forgotten, as we'll see the story in 11. Look at Genesis chapter 11. The whole world has one language. The whole world has one language, a common speech, and everyone everywhere could understand each other, which would be pretty awesome, right? That would be pretty helpful. Not with a translator or with Google Translator, not with any kind of tool. They just actually spoke the same language. And it's an incredible thing to live in that time. Even in this day where we have translations readily available. I coach at Lincoln Park High School. And because I coach soccer and because our community has many people who've moved here from Mexico or from other parts of Central America, I have several players who don't speak English almost at all. And one of them is a young man who's a very good player. And every time I explain something, I have to ask one of the other players on the team to tell him what I said. Even when I'm coaching in the middle of a game, I yell at him, and it's funny, I'll yell out to him as if he can understand me, and then I'll just say, somebody else yell out to him because we don't understand each other. He posted something on the Facebook the other day, and it was very cool. I could click a little tab, and it translated it right there for me. Funny thing was, Facebook said, is this a helpful translation? And I was like, well, how would I know? If I can't speak the other language, who knows if it says what he says? But even in our world with technology that comes in and helps very quickly, that can help us to see through the eyes of other people because we can learn about them, or maybe where there's translations that have been widespread. Our Bible was written in Hebrew and Greek and some Aramaic, and now we all read it here in English. Several translations of English. All right? Maybe you've heard the story of Don Quixote, which was written originally in Spanish. The world has benefited from those languages being translated. But can you imagine the creativity, the innovation, the beauty of humanity without the hurdle to jump of these languages? Without trying to do business in another place, in another language. It would have been incredible. So these people, okay, the children of Noah and their offspring, they find this place called Shinar. Genesis 11 tells us. Now, you know Shinar already, but you probably haven't heard it called Shinar often. It's better known as Babylon, right? Babylonia. This is the area where Babylon will one day be, which in the story of the Bible, if you've read it much, is not often a great place to be. It's not a sign of God's favor. But this is a place that humanity as a whole finds particularly fit for settling, right? And they decide to put up shop. All right? The innovation and creativity of the human race was unbridled as they learned about life and after the great flood, right? The world was altered in dramatic ways by this flood, but they still were finding new ways, new technologies, and new abilities to not just survive, but thrive. All right? And it seems commonplace to us now, but one of the most unconventional, one of the most radical inventions that happened, okay, think about this, back in that time, was brick and mortar. That's what Genesis 11 tells us. Look at the verses. It says in verse 4, that come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches the heavens. Right before that, verse 3, come, let us make bricks and bake them thoroughly and use brick instead of stone and tar for mortar. So somebody invented the brick, all right? And the climate, probably after the flood, was a little more harsh. It was more conducive for life before the flood. And the pressure to build hardy shelters was not as imminent because it had never rained before the flood, right? And so things got along just fine. And the pressure to innovate and build brick was probably not there as seriously. And now mankind is thinking, wait, we need more sturdy, durable, easy to build shelters. And finding stones and sticks just wouldn't do, or at least not for very long. And they began to bake bricks and tar them together. And with this versatile tool, the brick, I mean, I don't know last time you used a brick. If you're a mason in here, maybe you've used it, or maybe you've thrown one at someone. I hope not. But bricks are not something we often think about, but it has changed the landscape. We drive by many homes built with brick now. They have the power in their hands to build more permanent settlements, and more permanent settlements, you know what they do? They attract people together to share resources and to protect each other, right? And these mini cities begin to form. If you build a house, you don't want to build a house every 3 weeks. You want to stay in that house that you just built. And if there's some houses, then there's some resources or probably the area is conducive for building houses, and more people start building houses around you. And these settlements attract people, and these little cities probably sprinkled across Shinar, right? This vast plain area. You think about looking across and little pockets of people, right? They're not zipping to and from in cars. And they saw the usefulness of working together, that they could achieve things, they could be safer, they could harvest their resources quicker, they could do many things better in community. And the leaders decide, let's build it ourselves one city, a unified community, right? These settlements that are sprinkled out here, let's bring them together. It will be the most powerful, beautiful, creative thing the world has ever seen. Building this city will leave our stamp on the world. In fact, let's build a massive tower at the very center of our mega city so that people will see it from miles and miles and miles away. And people will know that this is the city of the gods, because our tower will break through the heavens. We won't be opposed by anyone or ruled over by anyone if we unify. You can hear the politicians of their day, right? This will solve our problems. You say there's a water shortage? Well, let's unify, because the people in the north end of Shinar have plenty of water. And then we can work together. Or you say there's danger from some predators on the south end of the plain? Let's unify, because we can send some of our best men to protect from this. And not only that, we need to band together to celebrate our dominance. We won't be opposed. Our tower will break through the heavens, and the sky, the politicians say, is the limit for us. The world is at our fingertips. Nothing can stop us. You can almost, it sounds like this election cycle or any election cycle, right? Humans saying, we can do it. Change you can believe in. We can do this. Meanwhile, God looks down from heaven. And just like, the psalmist describes him, he stoops down to look at the earth. I think there's an intentional reason that it says God kind of looks down. All right, when I was a kid, some of you may remember this. If you grew up in Downriver, if you grew up in this area, when I was a kid on a summer day, when it was especially quiet, probably a Saturday, if I remember, because there's less busyness, less traffic on the roads. And as a little boy, I would go into my basement, and I would go into my basement, and I would lay my head on the floor. And if I laid my head on the floor and it was completely quiet, and we had a stone floor in the basement at that time, no carpet, and if you listened at like 3 p.m, you could hear the salt mines below us. There's salt mines in this region where they're down deep, right? You see sometimes those little domes with like a door, and sometimes the piles of salt around them, where those often are elevators that where trucks can pull in and go down into the salt mines. And I think maybe the salt mines in this area, a number of them might have closed. But when I was a boy, you could hear the work being done. You could hear it. And you had to hear it, listen closely. You had to lay your head against the floor and plug the other ear and tell everyone to be quiet. And that's kind of what God has to do from heaven just to see this unified world tower. Right? He looks down and he goes, wow, this is this incredible thing. Let me stoop down and lay my head on the floor of heaven to see if I can actually see this or hear this. What's the ruckus? God has to crouch down in order to hear what the mighty humans are planning and doing. They said the sky is the limit, but really he has to get in the basement and plug one ear to know what's going on. The maker of heaven and earth is not intimidated by the tower of power. It's the tower of puny to him, right? And here's what happens. God's not impressed with the creation, we read here in Genesis 11, of humanity. His creation, when he finished, was, behold, it was very good. It was beautiful. It was great. It was worthy to be praised. But he knows that the people who are made in his image, they're setting themselves up for some evil intentions. They're going to be able to accomplish those evil intentions, it says. If you look at the passage, Genesis 11, they set their minds. The Lord, verse 5, came down to see the tower Verse 6, if anyone is people speaking the same language, they have begun to do this, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. That God sees that this unified community is going to be successful. It's going to be successful in at least one endeavor, and that's rebelling against authority. And community is going to be successful in planting themselves as the kings of the earth, the unhindered rulers of the earth, instead of spreading out, instead of filling the earth. Now, why would they spread out and fill the earth? Is it because of safety or practical reasons, or it's because of the command of God? Remember, he said to them, fill the earth. And now they're saying, no, rally the troops. Let's stay right here. That's right here. Humanity can accomplish much in unity. Among other things, at least one accomplishment is clear with unified humanity. It's a powerful force for disrespecting and disregarding God in the world he made. Humanity can rally and unify in the fact that they want to be their own boss. And this is what we see in Genesis chapter 11. Perhaps God was grieved with this rebellion as he looks at the same way he was with the unbridled violence before the flood. Remember that how his heart was twisted because he looked at the twisting of his creation that he loved, the torturing of, the murdering of, the violence of the people he had created to cultivate and give life and to celebrate and to grow the earth, right? They were destroying it. But maybe you can think of it this way: when God looked, and before he had judged the earth and made clear demonstration of the fact that he was serious about sin, he also remembered his covenant words and promises to Noah, that he would not send a judgment flood like that. That God had even said, I'm going to keep creation going, right? The spring and the harvest, the sun and the moon, I'm going to make these things continue now. I'm going to continue on. And so instead of crushing them as he did in the flood, he crushed the violence and evil that was being perpetrated, he decides to graciously confuse humanity. Okay? To confuse instead of crush them. And if humanity decides to unify against God, and God is going to pull the plug on their power, that's what you can think of it. He's going to, instead of just walking in and destroying everything, he's just going to unplug the projector. And no longer will they be able to display their own glory and their own authority. The raging force of their creativity, their innovation, their power was fueled on their ability to communicate, because unity was based on, decided in, it rose and fall with communication. Right? So God says without communication, their confusion will lead to dispersion. That once they can't understand each other, they're not going to stay around each other. When they start seeing each other as different, they'll divide. If I take the gentle back door, God might have been thinking, instead of the flood, spreading them out through the world because they won't obey the command I've given them themselves. Right? It was a chaotic scene the evening before as the sun went down. All right? Picture yourself in this world. Everybody speaks the same language. Various crews tied up their work on the tower and planned the enjoyment of their evening. All right? The sun starts to go down. Frank, he says, my wife picked up an entire slab of mammoth ribs. Okay? Come over to my house, you and your wives and your kids. Come over, and you guys come have a barbecue with us. Pete says, excellent, right? Excellent. I just finished a batch of wine, and I'll put it in the skins, and I'll bring it over. We'll get to sharing stories around the fire. Right? That's what's happening. The bonfire, then. We go to their house, their brick house. Top of the line. It's new brick. The fire towers, and Frank and Pete and their families, they're laughing around the fire, as many of you have done up north in Michigan, and they're chomping on mammoth ribs, right? They're holding them like watermelon, right? These big slices of mammoth ribs. And the little boys listen with wide eyes as their fathers tell them stories about the world and the people. Boys, Frank says, my great-grandfather's great-grandfather saw the world before the great flood. The little boy's eyes widen even more. Before we had ever finished three layers on the tower. You know, the tower was built like a stair step around. Long before we'd settled here, the world before the flood was lush. It was fruitful. There was so much fruit. There were trees towering taller than any of the trees we've seen. And the sun wasn't as hot, he says. The days didn't grow dry. It never rained. In fact, the dew kept things from drought. The ground was making it fruitful. We had to work, sure, but it wasn't like the way we have to slave now. It wasn't as hard as it has become. It's as close as you can imagine to paradise. And the boys' almost mouths begin to water as they think about the fruit, and they listen. And, you know, you can picture, as we have often in here, one of the wives bouncing a baby on her hip as she smiles about the story that she's heard from her husband many times, right? People worked, but not like now. Now we're slaving away. And then he takes another bite of his mammoth, right? No, life was good back then. You know what else he saw? My great-grandfather's great-grandfather. He saw the flood with his own eyes. The world was wonderful, and God ruined it. The world was wonderful, and God ruined it. God didn't like how much better humanity had made things on the earth. God didn't like that we were so innovative and so creative. And, you know, honestly, I think God was jealous of what we were doing down here. He was jealous of what we had done. So God did the most hateful thing you can think of, the most hateful thing the world had ever seen, the great flood. And thankfully, our forefathers, they had prepared for this. They were ready for what God had to throw at them. Right? They got themselves into a boat, a giant boat, and they survived the great flood. No thanks to God. And then they got back into making this world a better place. Frank paused as he swished his wine, right, in the cup, and he took a large gulp. You know what, boys? When we finish this tower, I'm going to march right up into heaven. I'm going to spit in God's eye and slap him across the mouth. I'll teach him myself. And they laughed and they joked around the fire. The whole family cheered. Maybe one day, when the little boys chimes in, I'll tell God what I think of him. And they united around this as they ate mammoth, and eventually it was gone, and the fire died down, and they went back to their homes for the evening. Now in the morning, Frank and Pete were the first out the door. At breakfast, it was like any other day. Just as the sun came up, they had a little food before they went off to work on the tower. But when Frank and Pete showed up to work, something was wrong. Pete was talking, but Frank couldn't make out a single word of what he was saying. Pete sounded the same. He used the same tone of voice, the same gestures, and some of Pete's words they sounded like he was saying a bunch of mismatched, jumbled syllables. What was going on, right? To make things worse, Frank could understand their foreman, Tom. But Tom and Frank couldn't understand Pete. And they looked at him with what had happened to him. But Pete storms off the job site in frustration and confused. And later that day, Pete begins talking with Garth. And Garth and Pete can understand each other, and they think Frank's an idiot because they can't understand what Frank says. They couldn't understand him. He's the odd man out. Frank could understand the butcher that day, but he couldn't understand a single word that the baker said. And the butcher's line was backed up because the butcher's worker seemed like he had gone deaf. He could not understand a single command the butcher gave him. He got fired. And so the butcher's behind, working, trying to catch up with no labor and no help. Things were unbelievably confusing that day. In fact, the baker was jumbling his words with everyone that Pete and Frank knew. Nobody understood the baker. It was absolutely confusing. And obviously, the world came to a screeching halt. Work on the tower stopped. People began to migrate to smaller cities. Frank heard that people that understood him, like Tom, were living on the north end of the plain, back where one of the original settlements was. And Pete and Garth They heard people down south spoke the way they spoke. Slowly but surely, people started to find others they could understand. The work halted, and they began to move away from the megacity into their smaller settlements and cities. Pete and his family, they gestured a confusing and sorrowful goodbye as they headed for a place where they could understand people. Frank, once Pete's best friend, had to find new friends and a new home. The baker had to find even a third place to call home. Trading was nearly impossible. These communities couldn't interact. And so they began just venturing farther and farther away for resources. They started looking other places instead of in towards these communities for land. And they began talking about their settlements as us and the other settlements as them. Now, it hurt Frank at times to remember Pete, one of his closest friends, and tell his sons that Pete is not part of our people. And a division arose. Not so many years later, the Tower of Power was only a memory. And wild rumors circulated, right? Spreading about the danger and the ugliness of others. Some of the children had never even met someone who spoke a different language than theirs. And they grew to be fearful and misunderstand those people. Pete's children are now parents. And they've lived in this world. And they tell their children how the others were the ones who caused the problem. Frank's people are the ones that changed their language. While Frank sat in his settlement and said Pete's people are the ones that changed their language. It was the others who betrayed us and abandoned the tower. They were the reason for the problems. And humanity spread across the globe, but they remained unified in one thing: sinful rebellion against God. Time went on, and people continued to tell stories about the past, about the great flood, and about their forefathers. But the names changed over time, and the details became obscured. There were many gods, some good and some bad, that had caused the things in their lives. Isn't it interesting that in our day, almost every ancient civilization we know of had a story of a great flood? Right? Many people worship the things they saw, the most powerful things they could observe: the sun, the moon, the stars, or gods that controlled things that they wanted to have. So the crops, or children, or protection, or a long life. They began to worship gods for those ends. The different groups of people became more and more distinct in the way they looked, in the things they did, in the way they communicated. They continued to share one common trait, and that was rebellion against God and commitment to human authority and power. But it was their people, not the others. Right? And there was a man named Terah we read about in Genesis chapter 11. Terah, he packed up his family, and he lives in the north of Shinar. Okay? He lives in a place that comes to be called Ur of the Chaldeans. And that's where our story began, with the tower, right? North Shinar. We don't know exactly why Terah, this man, years after the tower is just a memory, he packs up his house and his family and he moves away. But it was probably something similar to what happened to Frank and Pete. Not that their languages changed, but we all know that miscommunications and hurt and frustration happen even with people who speak the same language, right? It's not only language that causes confusion and pain and suffering. So, I got my thanks, Barry. Thank you. The next thing we see is that Terah and his people they move out, and maybe they'd made a mistake. Maybe Terah had done something that got him exiled from his community. Maybe it was something that was said at the funeral of Terah's son. It says specifically that Terah's son Haran had died. And maybe this offended or dislocated Terah from the community. And he packed up his son Abram and his grandson Lot and the rest of their home and their life in the Ur of Chaldeans, and they headed for Canaan. But somewhere along the journey, well, somewhere they found it didn't look so bad. They were far enough from the people that had caused problems or the people they didn't want to see anymore. As Genesis chapter 11, late in the verses, tells us. And they stopped and they decided this is far enough. For whatever reason, they settled down there, right? Out in the country. What I want you to think of is in the backwaters. So far from the Tower of Power at the center of the human universe, right? That everyone had known where the tower was. Now Terah had not even gone away from just the tower, but even from these settlements that dispersed from there. He was in the country. He was in the hills, and he was not connected to a major city. It was him and his family. He lived in the UP. Okay? Just kidding. He was far away. Nowhere anyone of power, anyone of prestige or riches would have been. Not even a city, let alone a mega city. And then something happens. God speaks. Look at verse 12, chapter 12. The Lord had said to Abram, "Go from your country and your people and your father's household to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless you, bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse, and on all peoples on the earth will be blessed through you." And this couldn't shake, it couldn't jar what we've read already more. Because the truth is, the Tower of Power that was supposed to break through the heavens so that Frank and Pete could spit in God's eye and tell him what's up, why he ruined the world, it never even cracked the ceiling. God had to stoop down and see it. The center of human power never got God's attention in that he came down to meet with men. He simply confused their endeavors. But now in the backwoods, so to speak, God decides to reveal himself to a man who has nothing to show for himself of greatness. In fact, his wife has no children. She's not even able to have children. He lives not in a major city, not in a major place. And I think that the scripture indicates in the book of Judges that he was worshiping probably the heavenly beings like the moon. So a man who worships the moon, bows down and offers sacrifices to the heavenly constellations, worships what our scripture would call false gods, he hears the voice of God. And not only does he hear the voice of God, he hears commands from God, and not like Frank and Pete told their children, and their children told their children, and their children told their children, that God was the one who ruined everything, that God who's the one who crushed everyone because he was jealous, that God was hateful, that God was stingy. But Abram hears what Adam heard. A blessing from God. Abram hears what Noah heard. A commitment from God to be a blessing. Goodness from God and kindness from God. That he saw in the way God spoke to him a dramatically different picture than humanity portrayed, but that God had always portrayed about himself. And God tells him to do something drastic. Not build a mighty tower, not build a monument for himself, but to go. To do what the people at Shinar never would. Isn't that interesting? The people at Shinar said, we don't want to be dispersed. Let's build a huge tower. Let's make this mega city where we all cluster together. They wouldn't go and fill the earth the way God had commanded them. He dispersed them through the use of his language, but he found a man who would do what? Who would go, who would move, who would leave. And he says to him, go from your country, from your people, from your father's household. You could read this as, from everything you know, and have a logical reason to trust in. From everything. Everything that's anything to you. The voice of God, God himself says, go. And if you go, in going, I will make you a great nation. What failed in the valley? The mega city of humanity, right? In the face of God, they were going to be a society worthy to be gazed on, right? That would be undominable, that it would never fail. It would be the center of creativity and innovation and power and human flourishing. And it turned into nothing of that sort. It was the center of rebellion against God. But God says, for this backwater man, go, and I'll make you into a great nation. You want to see a mega city, so to speak, right? I'll make it from you if you'll go, if you'll heed my words the way they never heeded my words. Go, and I will bless you. Remember we talked about that blessing in the Old Testament. It is the fulfillment of all of the satisfaction and desires of the human heart, first and foremost, and foundationally, the presence of God with mankind, but all of his good blessings that come with it. I will bless you. You thought the temple, this magnificent tower that was going to break through the heavens, was going to make this society one worthy to be lived in? It was going to make humanity this wonderful peace on the top of the mountain? Not if it's against God. God says, go, and I will make you into a powerful nation, a great nation. I will make you into a great people, and I will bless you. And I will make your name great. They wanted to build a tower that stamped on it, humans are awesome. Probably not in those exact words, but maybe. Right? Humans rock. That's what the Tower of Babel wanted to say. And that's not what happened at all. It actually was abandoned and left crumbling, the way God's world always does when humans try to take the reins from God's hands. But God would make Abram, if he followed his command, into a great nation with a great reputation. And not only that, he would be a blessing. Blessing wouldn't just come to Abram, but it would be transferred through Abram. That he would be a blessing. And that those who blessed Abraham would be blessed. And those who cursed Abraham would be cursed. That the way that people regarded Abram is the way and demonstration of the way that they regarded God, and God would respond to them in kind. And all peoples, listen to this, all peoples on the earth will be blessed through you. Everybody tried to cluster together in the valley and build this name for themselves, build this safe haven, build this wonderful society with at its core a rebellion against humanity, against God, divinity, humanity without God, and it crumbled by the plan of God. But now God was willing to accomplish the blessings through a man who didn't deserve it, in the backwaters of nowhere, with no resources at his fingertips. If he would listen to the voice of God and follow, he would become the source, the fountain, the father of a great nation with a great name, who delivered blessing to all people. And now look at verse 4 of chapter 12. We're gonna talk about these words again. But I want to strike something. So Abram went. What the people around the Tower of Babel never did, right? What they didn't do unless coerced was obey the word of the Lord. And Abram, he goes. He obeys, he went as the Lord told him. All right? And it gives us the details of that. And we're gonna come back to this as we see what Abram is all promised and think about how it develops in chapter 15, chapter 17, and throughout the scripture. But today, what I want to strike with you, is that fundamental difference, the contrast on display between the effort of humanity against God and the blessing of humanity under God by his grace, even against appearance. Abram was not where you'd put your hopes if you were betting. right? Put the people building, for instance, you picture it in your mind, the pyramids of Egypt in their heyday, before they crumbled. You see some guy living in a hut in the middle of nowhere with his family, sure, but not much. Or you see Pharaoh in Egypt with a tomb so big, people 3,000 years later will still come to visit it. Where are you going to put your money on who's going to really impact the world? I mean, I don't know about you, but I'm putting my money on the pyramids guy, right? Well, that's pretty incredible. We don't even know how they built them. People are trying to say it's aliens, right? How in the world would you pick the backwaters guy? Bowing down to the moon, right? The Pharaoh has people bowing down to him. Or would you pick the tower? The people who built the World Trade Center, or the people who build mud huts in the middle of nowhere? Well, if I'm trusting you in appearances and human strength and in human creativity, innovation, if I think that this earth is as we see it always, then I know where I'm putting my money. But Genesis 11 tells us very clearly, again, that the might of humanity, even in their unity, if it is unified against and separate from their Creator, it falls to the will and purpose of His plan, and that the blessings of God, even with the humanity's rebellion and distaste for God and rejection, failure to follow His commands, it doesn't fall. How incredible is it that the great plan of man crumbles, and that in these passages, this passage of Genesis right after that, we have, with very small beginnings, the building of, the fashioning of the blessing and plan of God that will come to full fruit in Jesus Christ. That the great name and great nation and great reputation and blessing of God comes through Abram, not through the people who built the tower. It came through Noah, not through the warriors of his day. It came through the person, not because Noah and Abram were incredible, but because they heard the word of the Lord, by His mercy, by His work in them, responded in obedience. Noah did everything the Lord commanded. So Abram went. The best laid plans of mice and men, right? They fall flat. Or as the psalmist says, unless the Lord builds the house, those that labor in vain. That's a living demonstration of the Tower of Babel. Because, guys, if it was really that big, we don't even know exactly where it is now, do we? It's not standing. But the fruit of Abraham's faith, as you even heard in Galatians or in Romans chapter 4, Paul says that Abraham is the father of all the faithful. And that Abraham, he will inherit the world. He heard God's plan that he would inherit the world, Romans chapter 4, verse 13. Even more than Canaan. He's going to inherit it all. Because mankind, even in its humblest state, dependent on God, is truly going to be reckoned with ultimately in His Son, Jesus Christ. That Jesus is the one who delivers the blessings that were promised to Abram, that started small and develop across the Old Testament and come to full fruit in the person and work of Jesus Christ. And that all who would share in the blessing of Abraham, okay, to be a blessing, to be a part of God's people, to have His presence with us, as we see in Genesis, we're going to see unfold, it comes through Jesus. In fact, in John chapter 8, Jesus stands before the great-great-great-great-great-great-grandchildren, more than that, of Abraham by genetics, and they prove that they are also the great-grandchildren of Adam and of Noah, who have the same sin problem that they did. And they look at Jesus, who God sent, and they don't have faith in Him. And Jesus says, if you were Abraham's children, you would have faith as he did. God can raise up children for Abraham, the stones from the stones. He can make a great nation for Abraham from the stones. Humans can't even make a great tower from the stones in this passage, but God can bring forth from Abraham a truly great nation marked by his blessing. And that happens in and through the person and work of Jesus Christ, who, though he was in heaven, deserving of glory as the second person of the triune God, receiving worship, he humbled himself and took on form of a man and became obedient even unto death. He, like his father Abraham, went as God called him to go. Abram left and went. Jesus, according to the word of the Father, went to the cross because it was the Father's will, not his own. Jesus was obedient to the words of the Father, and Jesus carried out the payment for our sin to cover the rebellion that we have committed, but also the obedience that enabled him to deliver blessing to us. In Jesus will all the nations of the earth be blessed. That he is the offspring promised to Abram. And he is the source and the fountain of the blessing of the world. If we turn from sin and trust in Jesus, we will find ourselves as children of Abram, which the scripture tells us is children of the living God. All of you in your strength, okay? I want to bring this quickly to application. All of you in your strength are working on your own to build little towers of Babel. You've got your house of cards in your house, or your clay, or whatever you like to make it out of, Play-Doh. You've got your Play-Doh tower you're building. Your career, your marriage, your family, your reputation, your wealth. And if you build those, aside from God, they are small versions of that tower. They are small demonstrations of that same condemning, sinful heart that will ultimately leave that tower, no matter how you bake the Play-Doh, in ruins. But if you demonstrate, as Abram, a heart of faith that follows the Lord, specifically in the word that Jesus said and spoke, and the ministry that he carried out, if you believe in God's Son, then you will actually partake in the great blessing of God that he promised to Adam and Eve, to Noah, to Abram, and to many after. Jesus said it this way: if any man hears my word and puts it into practice, he will be like one who builds his house on a rock. And when the storm comes, it stands, right? Built their tower on the rock, to use the illustration of the passage, right? But if anyone hears my words and does not put them into practice, he will be like one who builds their house, or let's say the tower, on the sand. And when the judgment comes, it'll be destroyed. When the flood comes, it'll be destroyed. This is both an illustration for us and an introduction to us of the blessing and promise of God that comes not through human might and strength and innovation and creativity, but through the humble in humanity who bow to the words of God, the maker of heaven and earth. I pray that we'll have a heart of humble submission that obeys the Lord as Abram. By first and foremost, how do you do the works of God? To believe on the Son he has sent, Jesus said. The work of God is to believe on the Son he has sent. It begins there. Let's begin there as well, like Abram, and go when he is called. Let's pray. Father, I pray